Welcome to Apartment Market Dynamics from MPF Research. Last time we told you what happened in the U.S. apartment market in 2012, and today we kick off a series on what to watch for in 2013. And we started off with perhaps the biggest buzz topic in the apartment business these days, apartment construction. How much construction do we have? How much is it relative to historic levels? How much further will those numbers climb? And where's that new development coming? Greg Will is here to help me attempt to answer these questions. And Greg, at the end of 2012, there were 224,000 units underway in the nation's core 100 markets. Put that number in perspective for us. How does that compare to the past levels we've seen?
Well, let's pick a historic norm there. And to do that calculation, you're going to get a slightly different answer depending on what you decide is the appropriate beginning point and end point for there. For us, we're going to call the appropriate beginning point 1995. That's when new construction started to ramp up a little bit after a really prolonged slump that reflected that we were recovering from overbuilding in the 1980s. And that 1980s number was out of control because of the anything goes lending environment from the savings and loan associations. So if we look at that 1995 to 2008 time period, we've got a chart for you here that illustrates ongoing construction for that 14-year period, and then the 4 years since then. The average construction in that normal period was 263,000 units. The high point there comes in the last half of 1999 when we were up to 357,000 units under construction.
So then our current number of 224,000, it's a little below the long-term average, but certainly far below the peaks that we saw.
It is below the peak, and it looks like there's a way to go, but let's do some calculations of how quickly we could actually get there. If you look at what's identifiable in the planning stages across the top 100 markets across the country, it's more than 1 million units. Now, a lot of those are not going to get built ever, probably just because the financing won't come into place, and there is a chunk of them certainly that it's new supply a long way down the road because they're still in the planning stages in markets where it can take years to get all your approvals. But having said that, as we look up the acceleration that was seen in late 2012, we think that starts in those top 100 markets for this year are going to be probably pretty easily around 250,000 units, and it wouldn't be surprising if we got too close to 300,000 units. So then add in the fact that of what's underway right now, about 74,000 units currently under construction won't finish until 2014. That gives us really by the end of this year, we could be really close to that peak seen for the last cycle.
And let's turn our attention to where that apartment development is occurring. And we like to group these metros into 3 different categories. And the first one are markets that are still recovering from the Great Recession. These are places like Phoenix, Atlanta, Las Vegas, the Inland Empire, and most parts of Florida. Those were the big construction centers from that span from 1995 to 2008. They accounted for about 1/4 of all construction in the top 100 markets during that time frame. But today, we've seen activity really drop off. There hasn't been a whole lot of new stuff picking up in those markets. They only account for about half of their normal share of total ongoing construction, so they're way below their normal levels.
Let's go to our second group, and we refer to these as the business as usual markets. They're places that tend to have fairly strong, at least on a comparative basis, employment growth and job formation. They did suffer some economic pain during the downturn, but it was really kind of a regular recession rather than any sort of game-changing experience. So what we see now, these markets are producing jobs at a pretty fast pace, and construction activity has already returned to what was pretty much the pre-recession norm. And key examples there, really 2 pockets. The first obvious one is Texas, and then there is the Carolinas pocket, although that really extends over into Tennessee and Kentucky as well. And then a couple of outliers on a geographic basis. I think you can put Denver and Salt Lake City in this same general group.
Then the third group are your traditional high barrier to entry markets. And these are areas that developers and investors just pounced on in the early stages coming out of the recession. Now we're starting to see very big levels of construction, particularly in the urban core submarkets for those metros. So ongoing construction is not only back to past levels, but in many cases, we're above the norms that we saw prior to the recession. So examples of this are places like Washington, D.C., New York, the Bay Area, Seattle, Orange County, and Minneapolis, St. Paul. You could also put Boston and Chicago in that category as well, but in those two spots, total construction isn't back to the highs we saw prior to the recession. It's just that we're seeing a lot of urban core construction, and in those submarkets, we certainly see an awful lot of construction, but we haven't seen a big pickup in the suburbs in those particular spots.
Jay, I think that group is interesting, particularly, and you have to wonder a little bit about what's going to happen moving ahead. Our general thought is that probably this burst of apartment construction in those markets is a one-time blip. We have some ongoing construction right now on sites that traditionally would have been condo sites, and as land costs and development costs rise, I think that really returned back to condo construction in those markets. D.C. maybe being the exception. You could certainly see some long-term sustained apartment building at really high levels in D.C.
Let's quickly run through a couple lists for everybody that quantify the ongoing building levels and illustrate some of the trends that we're talking about. We'll start with absolute building volumes, and there are a half dozen places with at least 10,000 units underway at the end of 2012. At the top of the list, Dallas-Fort Worth, 19,930 apartments underway, with 86% of those located specifically on the Dallas side of the Metroplex. Still not a lot of activity in Fort Worth. Washington, D.C., number 2, with 16,887 units, followed by New York at 15,389 and Austin at 12,470 units, and then just breaking the 10,000 mark with about 10.5 thousand units apiece are Houston and Los Angeles.
Jay, let's turn from the absolute building numbers to maybe a more meaningful is the inventory growth pace there. Another list for you here, we will look at the 10 most aggressive markets for building in terms of inventory growth. And by that measure, Austin is really in a category all by itself after huge starts in the past couple of quarters. The addition of 12,000 or so units there will translate to 6.7% inventory growth. Next up, we've got 3 spots in that fast-growing Carolinas pocket, while Charleston's overall building total is really just 1,700 units. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a small market, so that means inventory growth at 4.3%. Raleigh-Durham, where starts return very early in the cycles at 4.2%. And then Charlotte, which interestingly looked like it was going to lag behind the rest of the Carolinas initially, now has had a flurry of starts that pushed up ongoing construction to 4% inventory growth, with lots of that product just beginning to come out of the ground right now. As you move on down the list, a couple of small markets pop up. Salt Lake City at 3.7% and Little Rock at 3.6%. And then rounding out the top 10 for inventory growth are DC at 3.2% and DFW at 3.1%. Those two are the tops for absolute construction, but they're big markets, so it moves them down a little bit on the list for inventory growth.
And Greg, that takes us to the big question, which is, all this construction, is it too much? And the answer, well, it really depends on what your expectations for apartment demand are. And that's what we're going to look at in part 2 of our series on what to watch for in 2013. And in particular, we're going to talk about the improving single-family sales market and what that means for apartment demand, and also what that means for demand for all of this new product. So we'll get into all of that in the next episode of Apartment Market Dynamics. Until then, for Greg Willett, I'm Jay Parsons. Thank you for watching.
Want more? Go deeper with NPF Research's apartment market reports. From a national level, down to individual metros, to specific neighborhoods, NPF Research has been providing unparalleled apartment market intelligence to the multifamily industry for almost 5 decades. Learn more by contacting us at 877-284-4938 or visit www.npfresearch.com and click on Market Reports.